The Hanford Nuclear Reservation is a sprawling complex devoted to the research and development of nuclear energy. Located on 570 square miles of arid, sagebrush-covered land, Hanford is the workplace of more than 12,000 federally funded workers of the Department of Energy and several private contractors. Its annual budget of over $900 million supports a nearby population of nearly 100,000 in the cities of Richland, Pasco, and Kennewick, the Tri-Cities.
Much of the work done here is highly classified. Travel is restricted within the area, and employees are carefully screened for security clearance. Much of the work done within this complex remains a mystery to the outside world, and indeed, secrecy is a Hanford tradition. This is the historic B reactor, the first of 3 plutonium-producing plants to go into operation during the Second World War. Only 110 days after the atomic theory was successfully demonstrated in Chicago in December of 1942, construction began on this, the first nuclear reactor of its kind. Scientists and top-level government officials had reason to believe that they were in a race with Nazi Germany to develop this awesome power, a race which would decide the fate of the free world and would thrust civilization into a new era. But for the tens of thousands of workers who came here seeking wartime jobs, it was just another top-secret defense project, the true nature of which they knew nothing. That knowledge rested with only a handful of individuals.
General Leslie R. Groves of the Army Corps of Engineers was the head of the project, entitled Project Manhattan. Groves exerted nearly autonomous control of the atomic effort. His power, it said, equaled that of Chief of Staff Eisenhower. A domineering and ambitious man, some felt he feared the war would end before the atomic weapon was developed. The people he chose to carry out the massive job of building this weapon, which was to end the war, had to be of unquestionable capability, and they had to know how to work for the general. To build Hanford, Groves selected one such man, 34-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Franklin T. Matthias.
And we had labor relations problems, partly because we couldn't tell them what we were doing, really. We used other devices to try and get across the idea that, this was truly important. And we hoped we were honest about it. We didn't know for sure if it was. We didn't know if it would work. We never knew, till the bomb test in New Mexico.
This is the story of events which occurred at Hanford on the eve of the nuclear age. It's about the people whose lives were abruptly changed when the Army decided to locate the giant complex here. And it's about the men and women who came to this quiet valley and played a part in shaping modern history. Most of the film shown in this documentary remained classified for years after the war and is here shown publicly for the first time.
In the darkness of a desert morning, on July 16, 1945, the atomic age is born. Thunderbolt gives a preview of its destructive force.
The Hanford story began in November 1942 when Frank Matthias completed duties under General Groves in the construction of the Pentagon building. Groves next assigned Matthias to work on the newly created Manhattan Project. At Oak Ridge, Tennessee, a uranium processing plant was built to supply fuel for atomic bombs. The scientists of the Manhattan Project were convinced of the need for a second facility, one that would produce quantities of a new element, plutonium, which could also fuel atomic weapons. The plutonium process, which involved refining uranium into a new form, was barely more than a laboratory experiment. Even less was known about what type of facility could produce the substance. Eventually, it became Frank Mathias's job to build that facility. But first, the right location had to be found.
I sat on the site selection board for the Army in the Second World War. And one time I had a call to go to meet a man in Yakima on a site board trip. And in this site board group was Colonel Wiley from Washington, D.C. They were looking for an engineer replacement center. And I had suggested the location of the Horn of the Yakima River. A few weeks after that, in Seattle, I had request to prepare an area for an acquisition in the Priest Rapids Valley, and that was what became the Hanford Project.
Although other sites throughout the West had been considered, Hanford stood out as the obvious choice.
The Hanford site had beautiful topographic and geotechnical, geophysical, they used to call it, characteristics. That's the geology and the materials in the ground. And the ground materials were, we thought, very good for concrete right there on the site. And there it was just, all of the physical characteristics were fine. We had this big advantage of the Columbia River, a boundless supply of fresh water. We needed quite a few, I don't remember now what the number was, but it was a lot of water for cooling. And then the power, access to the power was great. Access to the cross-country Milwaukee Railroad was great. We had, just everything was good about it.
Having decided on the plant's location, project officials faced one more task before work could begin, that of removing the people who made this area their home. The valley, which was to be the site of the atomic factories, for centuries had maintained a thriving native population. The river gave them fish and driftwood to build homes and fuel their fires. Rocky upland areas gave them roots for food and medicine. When Lewis and Clark traveled through the Priest Rapids area in 1805, they estimated the number of the Soulcook tribe at 3,000. When other tribes signed the Treaty of Walla Walla in 1855, the Soulcooks refused. Land was not theirs to give, they believed, since Mother Earth belonged to all. As the area underwent change in the 1880s and 90s, the Wanapums, or river people, as they were then known, numbered 300. This was 1/10 their population of 2 generations before. The Columbia provided the new settlers with the same essentials it had given the indigenous population. Driftwood built their homes and fences, fish provided a food staple, and the river moved goods and people between markets. But most importantly, the river gave them water to irrigate arid wastelands and make the region a competitive fruit-growing district. The town of Hanford was built as a result of the dreams of investors who foresaw the potential of the district. Here, fruit ripened as much as 2 weeks before the nearby Yakima Valley, giving them an early start on a fruit-hungry market. Another town, White Bluffs, named for the chalky hills across the river, also enjoyed the early harvest season. A ferry provided a crossing for the east-west traffic.
Yeah, the people, it was quite a trying experience for those people. They came in there, so many of them in the turn of the century, and also during 1914 to 1918 was the big influx of people developing the real estate for farmland. And of course, with the World War II coming on, there was many of the people who had left there and had participated in World War I, I mean, and then returned, and then they had the Soldier Settlement Act that took place during the 20s and early 30s, in which veterans of World War I were able to come out and get some homes and land and start up small farms.
However, the soldiers were not successful farmers, and the Federal Land Bank had loaned them considerable money. They were not able to pay that, nor could they pay the irrigation district. So by the time I went into the Priest Rapids Valley, of the 15,000 acres of ground, at least 11,000 acres of it belonged to the irrigation district for the foreclosure of irrigation assessments. I then entered into a contract with the Priest Rapids Irrigation District to sell that land.
Abandoned homes provided a dismal prospect for new settlers of the Priest Rapids area. With land prices starting at $25 an acre and the potential for irrigation, there was inducement enough for many seeking a new life. Such was the case in the late 1930s for a large group of Mormon colonists.
That's right, and that's one of the homes that had been abandoned there on a 20-acre tract, and this man was interested in it and eventually bought the place. He then went back to Utah, loaded all of his possessions on a trailer, and took his tractor and hitched up to it and brought it back on the tractor and moved in. They started their farm, most of them ground crops rather than orchards, and were there for about 2 years, becoming quite successful. They brought all of their worldly possessions up from Utah on a trailer behind a wagon and moved into the buildings there. And as soon as they arrived there, they started to cultivate the land, planting potatoes and other field crops. It had just gotten to the point when they were getting a little return for their investment when the Hanford plant started.
As the year 1943 opened, area residents became aware of military vehicles cruising through their valley. Newspapers gradually put the story together, and local anger began to mount as the farmers' fate became clear.
So it amounted to quite a traumatic experience. The government come in, and some areas along the river where the reactors were going to be located close to the river, and of course a lot of your better farms was along the river because they got their irrigation water from the river. Those farms, those people were told that they had to vacate, and then some of them as short a period of time as 90 days.
Well, we couldn't have them there when the plants were operating. They were too close. We built our operating town, 25 miles from the nearest reactor. That wasn't accidental. It wasn't because Richland was there. It's where we wanted to be relative to the plant. And those people would have been, well, as I said before, we didn't know the kind of radiation hazard. If we were doing this again, I don't think we would have worried about most of the people right close to the river. And they might have worried, but I don't think we would have.
Federal Land Bank appraisers next arrived to determine how much the farmers should receive for their land.
There were a number of them arrived within a week. I was asked to stay as an advisor, but the Federal Land Bank had had very poor experience in the Priest Rapids Valley because they had made loans to the soldier farmers who had failed in their loans. And they had the attitude that Priest Rapids was not a successful farm area. That's why when they made the appraisals were very low.
So myself, as an attorney from Yakima, and Charles Powell, who were later federal judge from Kennewick, got together and we took most of these land cases and went to court with them. And the verdicts were so much over the appraisals, we had it reappraised by, well, Mr. McKenna from Yakima and several other appraisers around, and Mark Miller did a lot of the appraising, and the juries believed them, and it was so ridiculous that the government finally confessed that they were wrong and set other appraisals in, and they sent a good man in from California, a fellow by the name of Raymond. He later bought a ranch at Yakima, and he reappraised all of them. We settled putting all of them out of court. But if they'd have gone ahead with that original thing and everybody had signed up, why, it would have been a tremendous injustice.
Whatever the price, it could not replace the memories and years of hard work to those who had struggled to make a living in this valley.
And it was quite emotional when the war ended and we came home and had our first White Brothers Hanford post-war reunion in Prosser. A good number of the boys and girls that had served in the armed forces were there, and there was a feeling that we had no home to go to like many of the other veterans. They had a home to go to, such as it was throughout the United States. There was no bands playing for us, no flags waving, and no homes.
My dad homesteaded this place out of sagebrush, and the whole homestead had been leveled and put under irrigation, and a nice home built, and at least a dozen farm buildings built, and all this by his own labor and the labor that he paid for. Of course, getting up and moving them out at that time, all these roots were here, why, it was a tremendous impact on him. He never was the same after that, I don't think. He just broke his heart, my mother's too. And he didn't live too long after that.
When the Hanford Reservation was established, the Indian people could no longer have the right of access, as they had had for centuries, to fishing places at Walook, White Bluffs, and along the Columbia River in that reach to Vernita. That became closed ground to them. And the Corps of Engineers met with Indian people and explained to them that they could no longer range seasonally in search of these subsistence foods, the fish, that were so important in their lifeways, and that this would be their sacrifice in support of our war effort. The Wanapum Indian people went along with this, and they were in support of these efforts, thinking that these lands might be restored to them at some future date.
When the Army came into Hanford, then they says we can't go in there. All winter long we catch steelhead and whitefish, whatever's in river. Even we eat suckers through winter. That was fresh food, you know, from the river. We never get stopped, and wind, spring, we can do what we want to do. No, we can't do that.
In what became one of the largest land purchases ever by the federal government, landowners settled for a total of just over $5 million. And so the people of the Priest Rapids Valley were forced to join the rest of the world in wonder as the engineers and scientists of the Hanford Project proceeded on their course to make history. By mid-April 1943, Matthias recorded that several hundred employees had begun working on the secret project and that regular food service had been set up. In months, construction would be in full swing. To the amazement of outside observers, material and equipment began to arrive in mind-boggling quantities. Workers hurriedly laid railroad tracks to keep ahead of the flow. In all, 158 miles of track crisscrossed the site. The project site was divided up into 3 major processing locations, each well separated from the others. The 300 area would house laboratories and low-level radiation operations. The 200 areas contained the massive chemical separation plants which purified the manufactured plutonium into its final form. 100 areas, the reactor sites, were located on the river at the far end of the project. Here they could easily draw cooling water and be at maximum distance from population centers. The reactors were the crucial yet untried factories which would change the uranium into the man-made element plutonium. Giant structures provided thick concrete shells housing the atomic piles. At the heart of the entire operation was the atomic pile. Thousands of 4-foot-long graphite blocks made up the pile. Each block was meticulously ground to meet rigid specifications. They were then carefully placed in order under extremely sterile conditions.
After the shell of the reactor was put up with the graphite and masonite blocks and the steel blocks around it, it simply made an open shell with nothing in the bottom of it. And it was then that the people came in and brought in the graphite blocks, which were already milled and labeled in such a way that they knew exactly where each block was to go in this reactor.
Out here they had specially designed machines, and they machined them down to a straight bar and to very fine tolerances, and then they would mock up as many as 10 rows of graphite before it was ever shipped over to the 100 area, and then you would have this 40-foot by 40-foot section, 10 rows thick, and they'd measure the total deviation on that, and if it didn't come within a certain limits, they would have to tear it back down and take 1,000 off here, 1,000 off there, so that the sum total would still fit the whole pattern of these 1,500 tubes that they were talking about.
Well, in one reactor that I had to do with, which was a later reactor, DR, we got about 2/3 of this material in that shell, discovered that it was 1/4 of an inch too high, and there was no way in the world we could get a tube through that from these material being that high. So it had to all come out, be restacked, remachined, and then put back again. It was a terrific job.
The scientists really didn't understand the concerns of the engineers. The scientists really didn't know anything about lead time. They didn't understand that to build something that enormous, you know, you have to lay out the whole lead time for the development, and many of the scientists seemed to think that what they had built on their laboratory desk, you could just build 1,000,000 times bigger and it would work. And the engineers were the ones who knew that's not the way it was going to go, and they contributed an enormous amount.
Project officials knew they were working with an awesome and deadly form of power. What they did not know was the extent of the risks involved. Strict safety precautions were put into effect. Workers were given extensive training for protection from normal industrial hazards, but officials were more concerned about undetermined hazards.
But we didn't know what was going to happen. We knew we were going to have to dissolve the reacted or the exposed uranium to get the plutonium out. That meant solution. We knew there'd be all kinds of fission products that were radioactive. But we didn't know how much. We didn't know how much would float in the air.
And they gave me one set of instructions, and very short, and amounted to that they wanted us to be prepared to be able to evacuate 50,000 people from the Manhattan Project within a matter of 3 hours.
We didn't know too much about air currents. We made a heck of a study about air currents and airflow when we got Dr. Church from the University of Washington down to help us make that study. And we built a very high, 500-foot high tower right out in the works area so we could measure wind levels, you know, drifts.
Water from the Columbia was one of the major factors for the site's location here. Massive intakes for cooling water accompanied each of the 3 atomic reactors. Local government officials, although unaware of the true nature of the project, became very concerned over what was happening to the river and its precious resources.
What happened then was, of course, a monitoring of the fish in the river for nearly its full length to determine the amount of absorption of the nucleides, and this carried on over into the algae and to the plant life in the river, and of course became a complete environmental study under the aspects more currently of the Battelle Institute Northwest office. You wonder why the fish as an animal would be tested. In the first place, they could be treated with X-ray in water in their natural element under natural conditions, certainly not as messy as mice and monkeys.
Salmon studies provided valuable information on the effects of certain kinds of radiation on the river's aquatic life. However, it also served as a camouflage for classified studies of atomic radiation on other life forms.
We wanted to be sure that if we use the atom bomb, that in essence we would be attacking humans in their natural element, and we were treating fish in their natural element. And since there appeared to be a correlation in the biological effects of radiation, there certainly seemed to be in hundreds of thousands of fish test animals to statistically prove that such and such radiation starting at 25 Rankins, going to 50 to 100 to 250 to 500 to 1,000 to 2,500 to 5,000 and 10,000 rankins, that we knew we were covering the human range with these fish. We knew that there was a certain level of cutoff where there would be no life.
By July 1943, construction was proceeding at such a pace that an acute labor shortage became evident. Most of the available workers in the region had gone to the Puget Sound area to work in wartime factories. Hanford was given top priority over all defense construction projects in the nation. Recruitment agents of the War Manpower Commission and the United States Army were sent throughout the country to assemble the necessary labor force. Workers began to pour into the area through the Pasco train depot.
Sis and I left a bus in Coffeyville, Kansas, and we arrived in Pasco unrecruited, just hearing there were big salaries. I had been making $20 a week as a secretary, but I heard that at Hanford they paid $60 a week, and that was a lot of money in those days. And we got off the bus in Pasco on a rainy day, and the Pasco bus depot was in downtown Pasco, which was a very little one-horse town at that time, with a pot-bellied stove in the middle of it and some very odd-looking men sitting around it. And there was a Hanford bus there, so we talked our way onto the bus and went out and went to the employment office and both got a job. Two dumb kids from Kansas.
To house the growing army of workers, project officials decided to build one immense construction camp on the old Hanford town site. Quickly, seemingly overnight, a plywood city sprang up in the remote desert, complete with the infrastructure and services of a modern city. At its peak, Camp Hanford boasted 51,000 inhabitants, in effect making it the fourth largest city in the state of Washington. Hutments and barracks were home to thousands of men and women.
Well, the barracks was nice. There was two beds in each room, and they had baths and everything like that. And the barracks were all, I don't know how many we had. Of course, I was in the first one, so I was always there. Never had to move. But all the girls got along pretty good together. They were kind of a rough, it was, of course, the people from all over the United States, and some of them were pretty rough, you know.
I look back now and think of the fence with the barbed wire at the top that surrounded the barracks area and think, gee, it was almost like being in a concentration camp. It wasn't, of course, but this was to protect womanhood.
To feed the army of workers, 8 enormous mess halls were built. Food was prepared in assembly line style. It was all you could eat and cheap.
Didn't always recognize it, but it was good food and plenty of it. But the last person to empty the dish of mashed potatoes, and they were big dishes, you held the dish up and a waitress came over, took the dish, brought you a full one. Frequently on Friday we'd head for Yakima to eat out in a restaurant or for something to do. And it was awfully hard after 3 meals a day, every day in the mess hall, not to be at the old percolator in downtown Yakima and need some more coffee and not to hold your coffee cup up in the air to get a refill.
We had fish chips one day, and these riggers came in and didn't like it, so they just 8 of them picked up the table and turned it upside down. We used to put whole pies on the table, and of course some of these fellows had no compunction about removing those when they left. And I remember one day going through, and this man had a cream pie under his jacket, and somebody slammed the door right in front of him and smashed it all over his front. After that, pies were cut up into sections and placed at each plate.
The food and the wages were enough to bring many to work at Hanford. But to many others, working in the Pacific Northwest meant being surrounded by lush forests and majestic mountains. To them, disillusionment came in forms reminiscent of Dust Bowl days.
With the amount of construction that was going on, we had a lot of digging and dust was blowing, and I've seen people come out from Pasco on one bus as an employee and get on a bus going back from what we commonly call a termination wind. This was when the wind blew and the sand blew, and people just could not put up with it. They wouldn't put up with it.
Massive turnovers meant going back to the recruiters who were already hard-pressed to find the needed labor. Efforts to boost morale were devised. An employees association was formed to provide recreational activities. When Colonel Mathias gave permission to construct an auditorium, workers rushed to the task, building the 200-foot by 180-foot structure in less than 12 days. Hanford soon became a stop for big-name entertainers.
The idea of the recreation hall was to have something going on every night to keep the people interested and keep them on the project. And every night of the week, I think Monday night was boxing and wrestling night, but there were local programs, plus the weekends were always the big name bands were hired. Henry King and Kay Kaiser and you name it, they played there.
With improved morale and a belief in the importance of the job, workers felt a mutual sense of mission.
The patriotism of the people at that time was terrific. And I don't remember exactly who thought of the idea, but it was put forth that everyone would put in a day's pay and we would buy a plane for the Allies. And this is what we did. Everybody contributed a day's pay, and we bought a brand new B-17, which was flown into Hanford one afternoon and stayed long enough for a sign painted to paint the name Day's Pay on the fuselage. I heard later that this plane made many trips over the channel during the war and was finally retired. I don't know what has become of it.
The tiny hamlet of Richland, population 250 at the war's beginning, was to undergo a colossal transformation, for here would be located the administrative offices of the project and homes for 17,000 persons. Look-alike dwellings were quickly constructed, nearly 4,000 of them. Churches, schools, businesses. All the services a modern city needs were installed. Unlike the camp housing the construction workers, this new atomic city would be permanent. It would be a home for later generations of plutonium producers. In the summer of 1944, construction on the entire project was approaching two-thirds completion. Camp Hanford was at its peak population, and the various plant areas were taking shape. Workers stood in awe of the massive structures they were building. In only 1 year's time, they had seen vast areas of sagebrush desert covered with concrete and steel. Thousands of personnel were living in new cities built on the foundation of former villages. To all of them, this change had become commonplace. But to those in command, it couldn't come about quickly enough. They still had no guarantee that any of this would be productive.
And we made a big thing about it being something vital to the war effort and very important and all that. But we did that to our men, too, to try to build morale, our workmen. As we built up to a 45,000-man construction job.
I never really thought about what we were doing. It didn't bother me. My job was complete. My living was complete. In no way was I affected with any way to wonder, well, what am I, what are we doing here? Until actually they dropped the bomb, it just sort of became kind of immune to wondering what you were doing.
They said that we're doing something to win the war, and don't ask anyone what it is, because they don't know, and you don't know, and you don't want to know. So we just didn't ask.
The scene at Hanford changed dramatically once production reached full scale. The army of construction workers and support staff was replaced by smaller production crews who made their home in the new city of Richland. The growth of Richland spelled the end of the raucous Camp Hanford. Almost as quickly as it had come into existence, it became a ghost town. In early February 1945, Colonel Mathias drove from Hanford to Portland, where he caught a southbound train. His destination was Los Angeles, and he carried with him a priceless cargo, a box containing the world's supply of plutonium. The scientists at Los Alamos were anxious to receive the shipment for the test bomb they were building.
And when the train came in, here was this young lieutenant from Los Alamos there to meet me. And I said, do you have any idea what you've got here? Do you have a locked compartment to go back to Los Alamos? And he said, no, I just have an upper berth. And I said, well, you better highball it down and get yourself a locked compartment, because this is pretty important stuff. And he demurred a little bit about that. And I said, well, I'll tell you what, this piece cost $300 million. And if you don't get it to Los Alamos intact, you're going to be in a hell of a lot of trouble. And the guy highballed down to the station, and I waited for him to get his proper kind of accommodations.
As Manhattan officials worked on the home front developing their secret weapon, events were occurring in Europe which were to have a direct bearing on its use. In April of 1945, German forces were split in two by a combined attack of Russian and American armies. In a week's time, the German Führer had committed suicide, thus freeing his generals to accept the term of an unconditional surrender. On May 7, war in the European theater was ended. All along, the possibility of Nazi success in developing an atomic weapon had been a penetrating fear of American scientists and government officials. Reports of progress had come home from the war, which include these photographs of German atomic research centers.
Every so often there'd be another breath of pressure on us, to get things done. Get on with this thing. And when I read this German book, I could almost, not really, but I could almost identify the times that these added pressures came on by discoveries of what the Germans were doing. And it looked like they might be able to make it,
When Allied forces began their occupation of Germany, they found and captured production plants and research centers that the Nazis had fallen far short of their goal of splitting the atom.
You can pin down pretty much what the Germans did. And then the question is, was their lack of success on purpose because they didn't want to build a bomb? They just wanted to keep out of trouble. And were afraid that Hitler would demand the bomb within 6 weeks or something like that. Or did they try very hard and just weren't any good at it?
But I used to worry about the extent to which safety was incorporated into the design, because it probably increased the projects and the project costs like something like 20 to 30% beyond ordinary construction. And I used to think that all of that work we were doing to protect people, if we were in a race with Germany or Russia, that we started in with a heck of a tough handicap, because we didn't think they would pay any attention to human life. In their countries, it was expendable in the public interest.
Harry S. Truman, now President Truman, with the death of Franklin Roosevelt in April, traveled to Potsdam, Germany, just outside of Berlin, to meet with fellow Allied leaders Churchill of Britain and Stalin of the Soviet Union. On the agenda was the restructuring of post-war Germany and the unfinished business in the Pacific Theater. Japan's military might had by now been virtually broken. Yet she continued to fight on. To surrender meant dishonor. With heavy bombing leveling cities, it appeared that Japanese military leaders were willing to accept huge civilian losses in order to remain in the war. Already, 1 out of every 46 Japanese men, women, and children was dead or missing. It was felt that only a full-scale invasion would bring victory. No one could reasonably foretell the loss of Allied soldiers and Japanese civilians. Some estimated this in the millions. This was the context in which the negotiations at Potsdam were held. It was also shaping sentiment regarding use of the atomic weapon if developed in time.
And the driving impulse behind this for all of us was to save as many as 1 million or 2 million men if such an attack as planned by the military would ever occur against Japan. We did not want that to happen. We had a chance to make it not happen. We knew the German status from week to week, we hoped. We didn't know if Japan had an atom bomb. We didn't know whether the secrets had been furnished to Japan. We didn't know whether any other country might have it. But we were going to push our damnedest to get it before they did.
Regular shipments of Hanford plutonium had been arriving at Los Alamos throughout the spring and early summer. By July, scientists had nearly enough of the element to fuel a test bomb. In a remote desert some 200 miles from their laboratories, they prepared the test site, which they named Trinity.
That the time was getting close that the bomb was going to be used. And I knew about the test in New Mexico. And in fact, I helped write a news release that we had ready that described the accidental explosion of ammunition storage area down in New Mexico. That was going to be our cover story. And it was used, by the way.
Of all the milestones passed so far in the secret atomic project, Trinity would be the ultimate. The technology advanced in the past 2.5 years would mean little unless proven workable in the explosive device. That device was now being completed at Trinity in the New Mexico Valley known as Jornada del Muerto, or Journey of the Dead.
When I saw General Groves alone for a minute, I said, General, any chance of going down? I'd sure like to see that operation. He said, what operation? I said, the test, the what test? And then he said, well, you apparently know about it. I don't know how. But he said, I have decided that you and Nichols are not going to be permitted to be there. because you're the ones that are responsible for the production activities on this program. He says, I'm expendable relative to you guys. And I wasn't sure that was a satisfactory reason or not, but anyhow, I didn't go.
Even as the bomb was being raised to the top of the 100-foot tower on which it would be detonated, bets were being placed on its destructive power.
They didn't know what had happened, you know, down there. They didn't know if they would all be blown up or irradiated or what. They set up their own guesses, but nobody knew within a factor of 10 or 100 how this test was going to turn out, for sure. No, maybe the explosion will be 100 times more than they had anticipated, or 10 times more, or 1/10.
After a long and sleepless night, marked by violent thunderstorms, which threatened to cancel the test, officials waited in their huts just 6 miles from Ground Zero. It was 5:30 a.m., July 16th, 1945.
In the darkness of a desert morning, on July 16th, 1945, the atomic age is born. Thunderbolt gives a preview of its destructive force.
Potsdam, Truman received word of the success of the atomic test. He now had an ace in the hole, which he believed gave him an upper hand in negotiating with Stalin the terms for ending the war. The Potsdam Conference, thus, was to have ominous overtones for a post-war world. Meanwhile, at the American base on Tinian and the Mariana Islands, bomber crews prepared for a special mission over Hiroshima, Japan.
Well, the word came out, of course, to me from Colonel Mathias to this effect: Hanford, you can tell the University of Washington people, and you can tell your family to turn the radio on, to listen carefully during the day, and to believe what they hear.
I didn't know the day before. I knew it about 5 o'clock in the morning, and that the news was going to be broken on the radio about 7 or 7:30 Pacific time. And I was told, Jack Lansdale, the same guy I talked to, had called me early in the morning. He says, you better listen to the radio along about 7 o'clock, or you're going to hear something about that's important to you. And I knew then what it was. Couldn't think of anything he'd call that early for.
The reasons behind the decision to use the atomic weapon have been subject to historical scrutiny in the decades since. Some feel it was a military decision to quicken the end of the war and save perhaps millions of lives. Others feel it was politically motivated, a display to the world, particularly the Soviets, of our emergence from the war as the dominant world power.
It's so easy to make a judgment from, 1984 as to what they should have been doing back in 1945 with all the hindsight. So I tell the students to put themselves in 1945 and to realize that they didn't know anything except, to find out what information was available, what information was there upon which the decision could be made. In the light of the emotional feelings of 1945, the political responsibilities of people like Truman, the feelings of the scientists who've been working on this project, and whether they what they would have decided at that time in that kind of a situation.
I know on my part there was relief because the Germans didn't make it. We made it. And we almost cry at the ending of the war. I think I did.
I've never come to a conclusion yet as to whether Truman did the right thing or not. I don't know. Maybe he did. It's probably prevented any wars since then.
Yeah, I was encouraged to know that the wartime effort, the sacrifice that the people had made by giving up their homes and businesses and various community activities paid off in as much as that we entered the war with Japan, and it wasn't necessary to have a land invasion of Japan proper.
We just figured, oh, so many of those people were killed. But we didn't understand too much about it. But that's a terrible thing. But I don't know.
How you kill people, the method that you kill them, is immaterial. It's just a matter of efficiency, and that sounds very brutal. I do regret that there is such a thing as an atomic bomb. I would much prefer that our wars be settled with clubs in some remote area. But it's here and it's not going to disappear, so we're going to have to learn to live with it. Hopefully, we can learn soon enough that it doesn't become that horrendous thing that's predicted from day to day. That's a matter of philosophy. It has nothing to do with the construction of the plant, I assure you.